change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And with these fishermen, for them to be able to follow Jesus, as we read, they have to leave their nets behind because you can't bring them with you. And you can imagine how these disciples, if they're carrying these big crates of nets and trying to follow after Jesus, it wouldn't be very efficient. It would make it ridiculous in trying to follow Jesus. And those nets that they're carrying, they wouldn't be needed. When we follow Jesus and when we're called, we also have to leave our nets behind. We can't bring them with us. And for these guys, those nets were their profession. It was fishing. And our nets could be anything. It could be anything that keeps us away from following Jesus where he's leading us, where he's wanting to take our lives. So your net, it could be a job, or it could be a home, or it could be a group of people. It could even be some of your family. And all these things, they're fine in themselves. But in your path of following Jesus, they would only be burdens, and they wouldn't be needed to where you're going. So if these fishermen, if they carried their nets with them, they wouldn't be able to serve the Lord. So Jesus, he told these men that they wouldn't need them because he's going to make them now fishers of men. And Jesus, he didn't come up with the phrase fishers of men. That phrase, fishers of men, has been used for centuries up into Jesus. And it was used by philosophers. And it was them trying to catch or to persuade men into believing their own teachings. But here, Jesus uses this term, and it's a very appropriate phrase for these fishermen. And you have to realize the people that Jesus is calling. These are fishermen. These are professional fishermen. These are hard-working men. They're not amateur fishermen like us. They weren't just going around and going to the lake and doing nothing. They weren't just enjoying the lake. They were either preparing to fish, or they were mending their nets, or sorting fish, or they were out looking for fish. And they all had to work together and cooperate to be profitable in their profession. And so if you notice, these men, they had skills. They had skills that would be useful in catching men. Because you see, Jesus often calls people who are hardworking. But just like these men, we need to examine our own lives and allow the Lord to remove the things that don't fit his purposes. We need to allow him to be able to remove the nets into the ministries that he's calling us to. And in Hebrews 12:1, it says, "Let us lay aside every weight and sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith." So Jesus, he called these 4 men as disciples, and it was customary for rabbis to have disciples. So this isn't odd, and this isn't cult-like. And following Jesus, it was these men's own choice. They were not made to do that, just like it's our own choice to be his disciple. And so now these men, they're going with Jesus, and they're going all around the Galilee. And Jesus, he's teaching in the synagogues, and he's preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And he's healing epileptics and paralytics and all kinds of diseases, and he's freeing people from demon possession. And this is the first time that demon possession is ever mentioned in the New Testament. And what's really funny is we don't see demon possession mentioned this way in the Old Testament. I mean, we read about Saul and about him having an evil spirit visiting him, but there was probably just as much demon possession in the Old Testament as there was at Jesus' time. And there's probably just as much as there is in our time. The only difference here is that with the presence of Jesus, the demons couldn't hide. They're exposed, because you have to realize that Satan, he doesn't really like to reveal himself. He'd rather hide himself away so that people, they don't believe he's real. But there's so many stories in the Gospels where Jesus is in a synagogue and some demon, he just starts shouting out and acting up. But you have to think, and you think, well, those people with those demons, they were probably going to that same synagogue every week and for long periods of time without any trouble, without acting up, until Jesus came and exposed them. Because demons, they couldn't be comfortable with Jesus around, because demons, they knew who he was. And so now Jesus, he's gathering quite a following. And it's not like a band's following or like a Facebook following. These people are literally following him. They're literally walking with them. And we're told they came from places around the Galilee, but they also came from the Decapolis, which means the 10 cities. And the Decapolis, it was built by Alexander the Great. And other cities, they were coming from like Jerusalem and Judea. And it says beyond the Jordan, and that would have been the area where John was baptizing. And there were so many people following Jesus that he went up on a high mountain. And a mountain in Israel, in this area of Israel, is really just a hill. It's not like a high mountain like the Sierras or anything like that. And Jesus, he didn't go up on that mountain to separate himself from the people, but he actually went up there to make himself closer to each individual person. Because on that hill, the whole crowd could see him, and they could all hear him clearly. It would be like someone going on a stage for a concert. And tradition says that this mountain here was the Horns of Hayton, but nobody really knows which mountain it was. And then it says, when he was seated, because being seated was the proper position for a teacher to teach. And then when he sat, all the people, they would stand. And it was exactly the same way that it was in the synagogues, because that's how they respected their teachers. Now, we know that we don't respect me that much, so I have to stand because I'm trying to respect all you guys. We're just a little backwards. And so Jesus, up here at the Sermon on the Mount, he's not just teaching the disciples. He's teaching the whole group of followers. So this is a lot bigger than just the 12 disciples. And Jesus, then he begins this greatest sermon that's ever been given, the Sermon on the Mount. And people look at the Sermon on the Mount in a lot of different ways. Some people think it's God's roadmap for the world and for world peace. And then some people, they think it's kind of like a New Testament type of 10 Commandments, that these are the rules to get to heaven, that you need to obey these rules to go to heaven. And some people, they don't even think the Sermon on the Mount applies to us at all, that it just applies to a later generation that will come in the millennial kingdom. But the whole key to the Sermon on the Mount is found in chapter 5, verse 20, where Jesus says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." That's the whole key. And so what Jesus is saying here is that this sermon is for us. So Jesus is saying that this sermon is to you. So these Beatitudes are tailored to speak to each of us individually, and it was written with you in mind. This sermon was not written for the unbelieving world. It was written to Jesus's disciples, which includes us. And he's not dealing with laws, and he's not dealing with rules. Because if it was laws and if it was rules, then the scribes and the Pharisees, they would be really good at this, because they were really good at keeping laws and they were really good at following rules. But this is not at all about laws. It's all about character. It's about your heart, and it's about having a good heart, because that's what we are. And in our hearts and how we think, that means everything. And so Jesus, he doesn't start his sermon by criticizing the wrongs of the Pharisees, but he starts giving us these Beatitudes, the attitudes that we're supposed to be, that we should be. And the word beatitude, it comes from a Latin word, which is beatus, which means divine joy or perfect happiness. but a simpler way to think of this is as the blessings. And these are the characteristics of the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And that word blessed, or well, some people say blessed, it means happy. And so what Jesus is really saying here is he's saying, oh, how happy are those? And then he follows with what would make them really, really happy. And the way that Jesus uses this word blessed, he's always using it here in the present tense, which means you can have this happiness now. This is not just for the future. And Jesus, he's often misquoted in the very first beatitude because Jesus doesn't say here, blessed are the poor. There is no happiness in being poor or being broke. The fact is that being poor can actually bring a lot of misery, not happiness. And it's not to say that Jesus doesn't care for the poor, because he does, because there's no shame in being poor. Jesus, he loves the poor. But there is no intrinsic value in being poor. Being poor also doesn't make you closer to God. So what Jesus is saying here is, oh, how happy are those who are poor in spirit. And poor in spirit means spiritually bankrupt. And the word poor that he uses here, it does not mean the working poor. This word means the truly poor, which describes a person who has to beg for whatever he can get. So Jesus, he's not talking about those who don't have much, but he's talking about those who don't have anything, that they have nothing to commend themselves to God, which means they are humble, and that means they also have a correct estimation about themselves. So this is the opposite of pride or self-praise or self-assertion. But it's also not a false humility. It's not like one saying to themselves, oh, I'm so worthless, I can't do anything. Because pride and false humilities are don't be attitudes. And we're trying to learn the be attitudes, not the don't be attitudes. But this is being honest with ourselves. This is not to think of ourselves as too highly or too lowly, just to think of ourselves honestly. So Jesus, he's not speaking like your typical motivational speaker, like a Tony Evans, or like the kind of speech you would receive in a sales meeting where you're trying to get pumped up to go get those sales. But that's because this isn't the world's view. This is heaven's view of how to truly be successful, how to be happy. And the reality is, everybody is poor in spirit, but there's a blessing for those who recognize it and are willing to beg. And for these ones, well, they're going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And the reason that they can inherit the kingdom of heaven is because they're going to be able to fit in the kingdom of heaven, because they will look like the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. But until you recognize that you're poor in spirit, you really can't go on to the next Beatitudes, because you really need this being poor in spirit to be able to mourn over your sin, to be humble and to be meek. And if you can't sense your need from your poverty, well, then you're never going to ever hunger or thirst for righteousness. And if you think too highly of yourself, you're going to have a hard time being merciful to others. And so our second beatitude is to mourn. And what that means is to mourn over your sin and to despise it. And to defend our sin, well, that would be our don't be attitude here. But if we mourn over our sin and we see our sin as God sees our sin, we will be comforted by God, which means we will be forgiven. But we have to confess our sin to be able to be forgiven of it. Okay, and now we're told, oh, so happy if we're meek. And meek doesn't mean weak. Moses and Jesus were both called meek. What meek means is to have a powerful personality that's controlled. Uncontrolled power is harsh. It's also unstable. Uncontrolled power is untrustworthy, and it's unreliable, just like lightning. But the meek, they can be angry, but they restrain themselves from carrying out their own wrath. They leave that place to God. And the Greek word for meek, that's the word that was used to describe a horse when it's been trained or that it was broken and able to ride. So it means great power under control. Our English word meek comes from the Anglo-Saxon word mecca, which means equal or companion. So that means it's someone who doesn't see themselves as being superior to anyone, but they are equal, so they can be a companion. And so God's promise to these people is that they're going to inherit the earth. And this is talking about in the millennial kingdom. And so what you see here is what Jesus is telling us is that God, he's promising these people an inheritance, which also means that he's going to protect them from being taken advantage of. The meek, they will receive an inheritance no matter how they're treated, no matter how many times they're cheated. So these people, they will always be able to submit themselves to the proper authorities, and they'll always be able to abandon their own rights. And it's not because they're weak, it's because they're strong people, but they're also humble, and they're also patient, and they're also gentle. And if you remember last week, we talked about Jesus being hungry after his 40-day fast. And we mentioned that there were other types of hunger besides food. And Jesus says here, he says, "Oh, how happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." And what that tells us right away is that there wasn't righteousness happening at this time, or else those people, well, they would have already been filled. But for people to desire God's righteousness, it means to desire it from inside their hearts. This is an internal desire. It's actually to have a hunger for it. So this is a lot different than if you compare it to the Pharisees' notion of an external self-righteousness, which was the kind that they promoted. And so Jesus, he tells the people who have a desire for this type of righteousness that it's not going to be fulfilled right now, but there will be a day when it will be fulfilled and where there will be peace and there will be righteousness. And this is again when Jesus comes back to reign in his millennial kingdom. And then Jesus, he goes on and he says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." So these happy, merciful people, these are the ones who have already been shown mercy in their poor spiritual condition. And so that makes it only fitting for them to show mercy to others in the same way. And it's always easier to show mercy if you're meek and you don't see yourself as being higher than anybody. And if you really want God to be merciful to you, you really need to take it to heart to be merciful to others. Because God's mercy, and I'm not talking about salvation, the mercy that God gives us in salvation, but when you look at mercy and you see it in the scripture, it's usually conditional on the mercy that you show. And so now again, you get a little confession from me. I'm guilty here. I wish I've shown a lot more mercy to a lot more people than I have. But there's been times when I thought I had a right to be able to withhold it, where I could justify it in my own eyes. And I would really like to take it all back because I know that I need a lot of mercy and that I wouldn't have been able to even survive this far without it. So the next we read is, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." And so now we sit here and we examine ourselves, and you have to ask yourself, well, who really qualifies for this? Who qualifies on our own merits? But if you think about it, and you think about all these people that are listening to Jesus, do you think many of them would be able to recognize that they're actually seeing God right now? And until this sermon, until Jesus started speaking these things, all the words spoken to man from God had been through the prophets. But now at the Sermon on the Mount, you have this whole sermon given to men by God himself, by Jesus. But who recognized him? And I don't believe it was very many at this time. But here we have a promise to those who are pure in heart, that they're going to have a greater intimacy with God. And so I don't think pure in heart means totally free of sin or to be sinless, but it is free of things of being covetous and free of lust. There are people that are straightforward and they're honest, and they have an undivided heart toward God. They have an undivided heart toward godliness. And this intimacy with God, this is not just a future promise. This is for right now, because the pure in heart, well, they'll be able to see God in nature, and they'll be able to see God in people. They'll be able to see God in the scriptures, and they will be able to see God in everything, and they'll be able to see God everywhere. And then we get down to blessed are the peacemakers. And I know that the world, they love this verse, and they try to apply this verse to all the great world negotiators, to those who negotiate countries that are at war. And they try to, apply it to people like John Lennon or anybody who makes some kind of world scale recognized public stand, or trying to bring any two opposing parties together. But I don't think the scripture is talking about them, because they can't be sons of God without knowing God the Son. And these peacemakers, they still have to be in line with all the other Beatitudes. And you can never see peacemaking as making a compromise with evil to have peace. But what I think Jesus is saying here, I think he's saying it on a much smaller scale and on a much more personal scale, that he's talking about each individual heart seeking peace with their oppressors. And we do that by forgiving wrongs to be able to make peace, or by helping others in their families to come back together, or in the church to reconcile people back together again, where parties had actually really wronged each other. And there's always a cost to a peacemaker to be able to make peace and to be able to bring them together. And this kind of peace, this could be even a peace in a marriage, or it could be a son or daughter that's been estranged. And being a son of God means that they also have God's nature of reconciliation, because that's what Jesus, the Son of God, did for all of us. He reconciled us to the Father. So another way that we can be peacemakers is by spreading the gospel. And we can be a part of others finding peace with God through Jesus Christ. And this kind of leads us to the very next beatitude, which can happen to us when we do share the gospel. In this beatitude, it would be impossible to understand for anyone who wasn't a disciple of Christ. Because how could you ever say, "Oh, how happy are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely?" Because this would make absolutely no sense except for that next little line that says, "For my sake." But if you're being persecuted for your own foolishness, or if there's any kind of discrimination that anybody has against you because of your politics or because of your race, or for any just cause that you have, you're not going to find happiness with it. But if it's for Jesus' sake, you're going to hear testimony after testimony after testimony of the people who have been persecuted, imprisoned, who have been overwhelmed and sustained by God's very own presence.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,